On June 6, 1944, as dawn broke over the coast of Normandy, an armada of Allied forces prepared to execute the largest amphibious invasion in history. The invasion combined all types of weapons and machinery, and today we will talk about the tanks in the first waves of this operation. The plan was ambitious and critical, with tanks leading the attack, supporting infantry, and breaking through German defenses that lined the Atlantic Wall. They were to land alongside or immediately after the first waves of infantry, providing crucial fire support, demolishing obstacles, and securing beachheads for further operations. For this task, different specialized tanks were used, each specifically adapted for its role. However, not everything went according to plan, and there were some catastrophic mistakes. So, let's start by explaining the tanks used that day. The British and Canadians primarily used various interesting variants of the Churchill, Cromwell, and Sherman tanks, while the Americans relied on specialized versions of Shermans, adapted for the unique challenges of the operation and the job they needed to do. Before the operation itself, the tanks had to be prepared for challenges that standard tanks in standard roles do not face. Tanks had to be waterproof to prevent water from coming in, with the hulls and hatches sealed. The exhaust systems were modified to allow the tanks to operate in shallow water without flooding the engine. Snorkels were added to some tanks to extend the exhaust above the waterline, ensuring that the engine could continue to function while the tank was submerged up to a certain depth. Crews were often on top or beside the tanks in case of sinking, and some crews even had escape apparatus, modified from submarine gear, to assist them if they foundered in the last phase, where they needed to get into the tank and be ready to fight once ashore. The next challenge was to come up with a way to deliver those tanks onto the beach, some of which proved catastrophic. The British had modified tanks, really interesting and funny looking, but highly effective on the battlefield, known as Hobart's funnies, that came in handy for D-Day. For example, the Sherman Crab, equipped with a flail mechanism mounted on the front of the tank, consisted of a rotating drum fitted with chains. As the drum spun, the chains beat the ground vigorously, detonating hidden mines safely ahead of the tank and the infantry following it. This capability allowed the Allies to neutralize minefields swiftly, turning what could have been formidable barriers into manageable obstacles. The Churchill Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers was equipped with a powerful 290mm spigot mortar known colloquially as the Flying Dustbin. This mortar could launch a 40-pound demolition charge in a high arc for about 150 yards, capable of demolishing enemy bunkers and strongpoints. The mechanism for reloading this mortar involved swinging the mortar vertically to align with a hatch, through which the co-driver loaded a new charge. It proved great for clearing obstacles, barbed wire, and bunkers. There were also versions that carried fascines, which could be deployed to fill anti-tank ditches, and it was adaptable as a bridge layer or equipped with the bobbin device to traverse soft ground. Among the most feared of Hobart's innovations was the Churchill Crocodile, a flame-throwing tank that retained its conventional armament but added the flamethrower. The Crocodile's flamethrower, mounted lower on the hull, was fed by a flammable mixture, akin to napalm, from a towed trailer, minimizing risk to the crew. But there was one tank design that sounded terrifying for the safety of its crews, even in theory, let alone in practice. The American forces employed a unique adaptation of the Sherman tank known as the duplex drive, DD tank. These tanks were designed with retractable canvas flotation screens that, when raised, allowed the tanks to float and were equipped with propellers for propulsion in water. The primary goal of the DD tanks was to provide immediate armoured support to infantry by allowing tanks to swim from landing craft to the shore and to disperse the tanks as targets, making them less concentrated and harder to hit than the larger landing craft tanks, LCTs. At Omaha Beach, the plan was for the DD tanks to be launched from LCTs at a certain distance offshore, allowing them to swim to the beach and arrive at H10 or 10 minutes after the infantry. This was to provide a protective screen and fire support right from the outset of the landing. However, the execution faced critical issues primarily due to the sea conditions. The 741st Tank Battalion launched 29 of its 32 DD tanks as planned, but tragically 27 sank in the rough seas, exacerbated by high winds. Only 2 managed to reach the beach under their own power, and 3 were later put ashore directly. The 743rd Tank Battalion, witnessing the difficulties faced by the 741st, chose to land all DD tanks directly on the beach. This decision likely saved many tanks and lives, but came with its own risks, as enemy fire destroyed 2 of the 4 LCTs carrying these tanks. Fortunately, crew casualties were not as severe as they could have been. The tank crews were equipped with life jackets and positioned on top of the tanks during the swim, which allowed for easier escape and rescue in case of sinking. The tank commanders operated the tiller from the back of the turret to steer the tanks, which allowed them to remain somewhat more exposed but also more likely to escape in an emergency. The approach at Omaha was completely different from that at Utah Beach and British and Canadian sectors, where commanders opted for a safer deployment strategy. At Utah Beach, the 70th Tank Battalion launched 28 DD tanks closer to shore, and nearly all reached the beach successfully. On beaches like Gold, Juno, and Sword, DD tanks and other specialized armored vehicles were launched either very close to shore or brought directly onto the beaches. This ensured a higher rate of tank landings and provided the necessary support to infantry almost immediately upon landing. LCTs were critical in the tank's delivery and specially designed for this purpose. The front of the craft had a ramp that would be lowered and used to drive the tank off the vessel. The LCT would try to approach the shore as closely as possible to minimize the distance the tank had to cross in water. They were also specially designed with a flat bottom so they could operate in shallow waters. For example, the LCT Mark V was the common LCT of D-Day, well maneuverable and capable of carrying 286 tons, enough for around 5 Sherman tanks. However, reaching the shore was just one part of the challenge for the tanks. Once landed, they became prime targets for defenders and their artillery and anti-tank cannons. Besides the enemy, the beaches were littered with obstacles for landing craft and tanks, trying to disable or slow them down as much as possible. X-shaped anti-tank obstacles, Belgian gates, heavy steel gates originally used as roadblocks and repurposed to obstruct the progress of tanks, extensive minefields, and the sandy beach itself, all made every inch of the ground that had to be crossed extremely dangerous and painful. Tank commanders even dismounted in some cases and tried to navigate their tanks on foot, trying to find the safest passable path. Despite enormous challenges, the tanks of D-Day supported the infantry, cleared paths through the beaches, and blasted the remaining German bunkers securing the stronghold. Out of approximately 700 tanks planned to support the landing, across all beaches on the first day, about 300 landed. However, the struggle was far from over. In the days following the landings, the German elite SS Panzer divisions, equipped with superior Tiger and Panther tanks, were racing to the front, setting ambushes in a terrain of thick hedgerows and narrow lanes, ideal for defensive warfare. The dense foliage and limited visibility provided the Germans with ample opportunities to leverage their firepower and tactical advantages, posing a grave threat to the advancing Allied forces. Thus, while the initial mission of securing the beaches was an overall success, it marked just the beginning of a prolonged and intense phase of the campaign. The battles that ensued would continue to test the tanks and their crews as they pushed deeper into enemy territory, striving for the ultimate liberation of Europe and the defeat of Nazi Germany.